So I'm Osha, and we're going to talk a little bit tonight about React Redux and Redux hooks. So as Jen was saying, I decided last year to change careers. I had been picking up little back-end stuff at my business because web design was a really expensive part of our business. And I was like, I need to learn this if I want to save a little bit here and there. And so when it came time to make in 2020, before COVID, I was like, hey, I'm not sure if this is what I want to do with my life. If I had to pick anything, what would I do? And so I told my husband I wanted to maybe look into a coding boot camp, and he was like, absolutely not the time. And then when COVID happened, I was like, how about now? And he's like, yep. So this is what, so I went to Flatiron and it was great. And when we got to the section in bootcamp where we had to learn React and Redux, I picked up React and I was like, I love the front end. So I love the front end, and Redux kind of was thrown at us at the end. It took me a lot of studying on my own to try to figure out how to actually use Redux, how to get more comfortable with it. I think from what I've been seeing over the past few months is a lot of people get stumped on Redux and trying to implement it for state. And I will very much admit that I built a nonprofit website in January, and I was so bad at Redux that I was like, I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way and pass all of my state through props and through components. And then I decided last month or 2 months ago that I was gonna just tackle it and become a pro at Redux. So yeah, so we'll talk a little bit tonight about what is Redux, why use it, the original setup of Redux, and then the new React Redux hooks that came to React came to Redux in 2019. If anyone has any questions while I'm going through the slide, please unmute yourself. Or, you know, if I misspeak on anything, like please, I can't see the chat. So yeah. I also sent Jen the links for, I set up a GitHub front end and back end. And then I also hosted the back end. So if anyone wants to follow along or maybe take any of these repos and work on it yourself at home, or reach out to me in the next few days in the afternoons, and you want to work on these together, I'm so happy to do that. So passing state between parent and children components through props is a great option, and it works beautifully, especially when you have small applications. But eventually our applications just get so big and our state gets so ginormous, coming like all the data coming to us from the back end, that we have to have some kind of easier way to manage this. And, you know, if you're used to working with React, we all know that we have, you know, this ancestor that passes down all the props through the parents to the children. And then the children have to pass back callback props in order to, you know, if they change or manipulate the state. And they have to be able to, you know, just keep on continuously passing them back up and down through our nested components. And this is fine, like I said, but eventually, like, you start to have this problem where, you know, if you have a child from one parent, that child, that cousin, doesn't really actually know what's going on unless this kind of avenue, this motion happens, this movement happens through our components. And so, you know, it's pretty hard work. And so there are a number of different libraries that we can use to get our state managed and to make it a little bit easier on ourselves as our applications grow. And so why use Redux? I think, you know, a lot of, even in the React and Redux documentation, everyone talks about that, like passing these props are an incredible thing and they work just fine. And it's always good to kind of, when our applications are small, to do it that way. But eventually, when it becomes a job, we need a library that is going to be responsible for keeping and passing along our state. And so with Redux, it allows us to store all of our application state in a separate JavaScript object from our components called the store. And here I have a little small example. Can everybody see it okay, or is it pretty small? Good. Okay, good. Awesome. So for example, I have set up a little application of musicians, of female musicians. And so when we set up our index file, we'll set up, and I just want to apologize ahead. If anyone already knows all this about Redux, that's great. I kind of was just wanted to give a little refresh on how Redux is working, maybe for some people that aren't used to it. And so we have our index application, or our index file. And in this file, what we're going to do is we're going to take the provider that Redux gives us, that React Redux gives us, and we're going to wrap it around our entire set of nested components. We're going to set a variable of the store and bring that in. We're going to create that store from Redux, and we're going to send that along as a prop to the provider that's wrapping our application. Now at this point, because of this provider that we get, our entire application in any component that we're in will have this ability to independently connect to our store. So with the original setup of Redux, if we take a little closer look, we can see that now, instead of having to pass in and have our state be called here, so without Redux, we would be calling our async functions in this file. And now we can kind of eliminate that, and we can connect. You'll see on the very bottom, the connect higher order function connects a React component to our Redux store. And so through the use of mapStateToProps, which is our first argument to connect, and mapDispatchToProps, which is our second argument to connect, we now have this access anywhere in our application. And mapStateToProps is giving us that ability to connect and extract our data. And mapDispatchToProps is allowing us to dispatch the actions to our Redux store. So for example, we can go a little bit more into that mapDispatch a little bit later, but those actions are actually what's calling our async functions now. Ooh, I'm a little nervous. And so what we have, if we take a deeper dive into the file, is as soon as our component loads in React, and I made this example as a class just to kind of keep this component looking like what it did before any hooks came along whatsoever. So we have our component did mount. As soon as our component mounts, we call this dispatch get musicians. And so we can see that where that function actually comes from is all the way on the very bottom on line 42 of the file. We're actually taking our actions, which are now async functions because of the middleware of Thunk. And we wrap that with dispatch coming from Redux. And so what that does is it gives us the ability to say, hey, I'm telling you that it's okay to go do our async function, go to the back end, get the data that we need. And then I want you to go ahead and set off the chain of events that's going to, eventually get us into the reducer, which will take our actions and set all of our data in state. And then in the reducer, all of our state will live from here. And that's actually the reducer is really where we're calling what we're calling our store. And then we have mapStateToProps. And again, mapStateToProps is how we're extracting all of that data out of our store or out of our reducer. And so this is great. And you can see we have about 45 lines of code here. And it works really well. And from here, you know, just showing a really quick overview is if we have this musician reducer, and let's say we've used a dispatch action and we've set our musicians in state. Now, from any single one of these components that are nested in our application, we can go into our store and pull out our data that we need. And the same would be if we were to set up a song reducer, you know, the state of song, we'd be able to do that same exact thing as well. And so again, like I was saying a little earlier, I don't think that Redux is necessarily the best and the only option. There's a lot of different other libraries that work really well, from mobx, Recoil, Akita, and Hookstate. I'm really partial to Akita because my little Shiba-Inu looks exactly like that almost. And so all these libraries are incredible state management libraries, and they all work depending on the size or the function of your applications. And then along with Redux hooks, we also got another hook, a React hook called Use Context. And context in React, I know only a little bit about that. Context is doing the same exact thing. It's allowing us to work pass state through the React tree without ever having to pass through each component level individually. So that use context is another great option. But then in 2019, when we got the React hooks, we now have the React Redux hooks, and it's just taking that simplification of state management to a whole new level. So in 2019, React came out with hooks, made it possible to work with state and functional components. We no longer needed these kind of confusing class components. We no longer had to worry about this that was happening in class components. We were able to go directly into our state. With functional components, we couldn't actually work with state before. And so hooks allowed us the ability to work with state directly in our functional components with use state and use effect. Let's see, Redux jumped on the chance. As soon as those hooks were created, there was also the ability to create your own hooks, custom hooks. And so Redux jumped on the chance to make a custom hook. And not only did they make one, I think that they actually ended up making 4 of them. We're going to talk about 2 of them tonight. So with Redux hooks, we have our two main hooks, which is useSelector and useDispatch. useSelector is exactly like mapStateToProps, and useDispatch is exactly giving us the functionality of mapDispatchToProps. But in the instance of the hooks, we now don't have to use that connect higher order function to connect to the Redux store. As long as we import from React Redux, we import useSelector and useDispatch. You can still do this anywhere in your components. And it's very simply just making a function of useSelector and passing in an argument of state and returning the state exactly how you want it and setting it to a variable. And then with useDispatch, we actually set the function of useDispatch to a variable. And, you know, it can be a little bit confusing if you haven't worked with React hooks before, but use effect works almost exactly the same as componented mount. As long as your second argument to use effect is this open bracket here that you see on line 20, it will only happen one time. So as soon as this component mounts, it will call the get musicians action and wrap it in that dispatch that we had seen earlier in Redux hooks. And you'll see that now we have about 39 lines of code. So we've saved 7 lines of code by doing this. And there's a couple other really fun things that happen with hooks. So simplistically, not only are we cutting down the lines of code, but when we connect to the Redux store this way, we actually know where our props are coming from. And so like without having to use that connect and then wondering if the props are being passed down or if and they're coming in from the parent component, we actually know that those props, as long as we name them to the variable, we know that those props are actually coming directly from our Redux store. And so then with brownie points, I just need to figure out how to move everyone. I cannot, my little mouse isn't working here. Oh, maybe. So I actually can't see the brownie points. I hope that you guys can see it. But if I remembering correctly, what I wanted to talk about was just that useSelector doesn't just bring in and just doesn't return objects any longer. They can return any data structures to us that we need to use. And then let's see. Oh, I'm drawing a blank on the second thing. But something that I find really cool is that you can use selector multiple times in one functional component. But you have to be a little bit more careful just to talk about the side effects that happen when you use hooks. One thing is with memoization. So because memoization kind of caches our data and allows us to speed up our programs by using caches, it can get a little bit tricky and a little confusing, and you just have to make sure that you're kind of taking care and using the hooks in the correct way and using them in components that are actually not giving you side effects. And so at this time, if anybody wants to go through, we can take a look at the actual front end code and look at every component and how it's working. We can look at the reducers and the actions and stuff like that. If you guys wanted to kind of just give me a thumbs up if that's where you want to go to, we can definitely go into the code. I see Jen. Awesome. Excellent. All right. Now I have my mouse back. I'm very excited. All right. So like I was saying, I built a little application for us tonight. And you can see that if we go into our index file, it looks exactly like the file that I had pasted up in the slides. And so straight up from the very beginning, we are calling on Redux. We're calling on React Redux for our provider. And then we're also calling on Thunk. And I'm sure many of you already know this, but Thunk gives us the ability to return functions from our actions, not just objects. And before Thunk, we weren't able to actually put our async functionality into our action files. So just to kind of give you a breakdown of my file structure, I have a folder just for my Redux where my actions and my reducers live in. And so if we go into app 1, this app 1 is actually showing the class component. And then app 2 is showing the functional component with Redux hooks and React hooks. So it will give us the exact same output that we're looking for, the exact same render that we're looking for. But, again, that's just doing things a little bit more cleanly. And then we know when we console log where our props are coming from. Our actions, for example, this is our async action that's happening in our Redux action. And then in the reducers, I have a musician reducer. And after we call our async and call our musicians path, as soon as we retrieve that data, it comes in and we're just telling it that you have 3 different actions that you can commit to the reducer. You can say, hey, I am fetching the musicians right now. I have fetched them successfully, or I've had a failure when I was completing the action. And it will send this action into our reducer. And from here, our reducer will use a switch case to determine, okay, which action did you send me? And we hold our initial state here. It goes in as an argument for this function. The initial state becomes our state. And then if it's a success, we'll set our state musicians. In that object, we'll create a new object for all of our musicians. And if there's a failure, we want to catch that error and then send that error back into state. And so if we, for example, are coming in here and we're working on app 2, once we dispatch this get musicians, as soon as that happens, oh, that was the second thing that was on my little brownie points, and now I remember it. Awesome. So as soon as the component loads and this dispatch action is kind of kicks off, the useSelector actually knows that our state has actually changed, and it will cause that immediate re-render of our component. And what's really exciting and interesting about useSelector versus mapStateToProps is that useSelector is using like the triple equality function, and it knows that if something happens directly in our state to change, it's going to cause that re-render. And it's a lot more selective about the re-renders. And so instead of our components automatically always re-rendering every time we map state to props and we call that functionality, like it's not going to do that, which actually slows down our components. It's actually going to say like, hey, do I need to re-render right now? If not, I'm not going to slow down the program doing so. And if so, like, yes, let's re-render so that we give, we actually cause that force re-render on our component, and our DOM actually like re-renders for us and gives us our new view. So from here, I just do a really quick changing. I send along the musicians back down, or I send it down to my musicians component. And the reason that I'm actually doing it in the parent component and putting all of my hooks and all of my actions in that parent component is because that component, if it immediately loads, and it won't call that musicians component without first having those props. And you're safer, and it's just a safer bet for you to actually have your musicians set and send it along as the parent, because if you don't call it until the child, a lot of times what will happen is there will be some miscommunication with like the re-rendering and not having our props available, and then all of a sudden our musicians is actually becoming undefined. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have any questions or yeah.
I have a quick question, Osha. So
Yeah.
I worked only like with classic Redux before, and I remember they use containers. So using hooks, you don't need containers anymore, right?
So this is actually, it's really funny. This is actually a question that came up to me during my interview with TableXI. And when they had me build an application before coming to, I think, my third interview out of 4 interview sets with them. And when I was in boot camp, we were taught that for years, and I guess it's a big thing that Dan Abramov from React actually talked about for a really long time. For years, everyone was really being strict on having there being containers, and then having components versus containers and keeping everything separated. And when I built my application, I built it with containers because I was like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to show that I'm fancy and I know what containers are. and I'm gonna send this along to them. And then when we got into the meeting, I think about like 10 minutes into the meeting, they're like, hey, can we stop you for a second? We'd like to know why you have containers. And the way that they explained it to me was it wasn't necessarily because of hooks. It was actually just a design, and it is always based on if the team wants the design to have containers or not. And I would really love it if anyone else would want to come in and talk about this as well, because I don't know if it's actually, and I don't think it's actually a thing because of hooks. Anna, do you know if it is because of hooks?
To be honest, no. And yeah, I'm so bad with Redux, and I came here just like to learn from you because my company is using Redux, but this first month was so overwhelming. I didn't have a chance like to really deepen my knowledge of it.
Yeah.
So no, I cannot explain why we don't need containers, but
Yeah.
that's a good question to explore.
Yeah. And the way that they kind of told me, they were like, before we get into, so TableXI is a company that does commission work. And so they work on a number of different applications for a number of different companies. And, out of the 30 developers that they have on the team, everyone gets kind of branched off into different teams all the time to work on these different applications. And he said that they actually make sure to dedicate a certain part of one of the first days of building an application to talk about how they want to have their files set up and structured. And that containers are something that a lot of them are really doing away with because they don't feel the need for containers, and because there's been so much argument about like what consists of a container, or what makes up a container. Yeah, I don't know is there anyone else that has thoughts about containers? No. Yeah, and so like, I kind of, after talking with him, he was like, you just have to have a kind of joint consensus when you're building them. But I don't think it's a thing purely based on hooks, because I think you can still have them. Is there any other questions about the reducers and about Redux?
One question I had, thank you so much, by the way. So in the get musicians.js, I think it's like kind of part of your action.
Yeah.
Right? So I was wondering why you made the fetch call here, as opposed to just keeping this like strictly what the actions are. Maybe I don't understand Redux enough, so maybe you needed to have the fetch call. That's kind of my question.
No, and I'll do my best, but I'm also learning just like you guys, by the way. So so from what I understand, and from what a lot of our cohort leads kind of taught us, is that you have your actions because you want to keep, just like how you do in your backend, you want to make sure that you're keeping everything in their separate MVCs. And so if you have like your model, your view, and your controllers, like if you're trying to keep all of your data coming into one component and keep it separated, like your actions are a really good place to have that. And then you're sending, like, if you do all of your work to get your data in your actions file, then you can just easily send that data along wrapped in dispatch to your reducer. Does that make sense? I hope. I see some head nods. Alyssa, is that what you were asking?
Yeah, so it seems like it's just like a kind of easy way to bundle your data. There's many ways to do it, but this maybe thinking in like the line of like single source of truth, like wanting to find that in this way.
Yeah, that's a great, I think that totally makes sense to me as a great way to put it, is that single source of truth, and just making sure like that each component is doing and holding, like it is doing its job, right? It's not doing everyone else's job or 5 jobs in one area. And so I think that that's a really good aspect of like, we wouldn't want to put our fetch inside, I mean, of course we could put it in app where we're like in here. Of course we could do it in our use effect and we could put our fetch in here. That's no problem. You know, but in this way, we're setting it aside in another component. We're importing that component into this component here, and we wrap it in dispatch so that it knows automatically as soon as that fetch is complete, as soon as your promise has been fulfilled, you just want to take that data and send it into the reducer. And that's what that dispatch is doing, is it's telling it like, hey, I gave you a job to do, like go, I'm dispatching you to go do your job. Yeah. Anybody else?
Can you go back to the get musicians JS?
Yes.
And I'm curious on line 2, where you're importing fetch musicians and fetch musician success. Where is that being imported from?
Yes. So it is happening in my action constants. Thank you for catching that, James. I definitely did not talk about this file. So these constants, it is just industry practice to set a constant to your string. And from what I understand is that the reason that you want to set this string that you're setting as an action, the reason that you actually want to set it here to a constant is because there's less chance of you actually kind of messing up the names of your constants later on in your reducer. There's less chance of bugs. And so if, and you can definitely still set these constants directly in your action file. I've seen that, you know, 50-50, the same exact way. But it's just, I like to keep them separate because as the application grows, if all of your actions are in here listed and named, that way I can make sure that I don't reuse the same names in other components that will mess up. Like by the time it hits the reducer, I'm using the same constant name that I used in another action file. And that way I can just keep them all in one place and kind of see what I'm doing. Yeah. And another thing too, is I recently started to do this, and I think it can kind of come as second nature to a lot of people. But I started setting my constants in a separate file. And so this way I can change my constants very quickly and with one line of code versus going in and changing it in 50 different places in my application. Because while we're developing, if we have our local host that we're working with, and that's the API that we're completely always like fetching data from, as soon as we set that backend to be live, we need to change our constant. And so I like to now keep this in its own file. So all I have to do is, if I'm working and I'm developing, great. All I have to do is that. And I don't have to change 50 million places of API. So yeah. Anybody else have any questions?